Now we're going to have a look in this video at costing a product. So we're going to work through some examples. So for example 1, part 1, I'm going to set up the details first. A manufacturing firm has budgeted for the following costs for a period. Direct materials are $138 per unit, direct labour $15 per direct labour hour. The indirect costs, we've got electricity 100,000, repairs 95,000, miscellaneous factory costs 10,000, cleaning materials 15,000, depreciation of factory machinery 330,000, and indirect labour of 250,000. The estimated direct labour hours is 100,000 hours, and the estimated machine hours is 80,000 hours. Okay, so remember that the indirect costs, the estimated direct labour hours, and the estimated machine hours are all estimators. They're all estimated because we're doing this at the start of the period so that we've got a rate that we can use for the coming accounting period. So what's required is calculate two different budgeted overhead rates that could be used for the coming year. Note that direct material and direct labour are not included in the calculation of overhead because they are not dependent on a method of overhead allocation and will remain the same regardless of the overhead method chosen. So just remember that direct material and direct labour are not overheads. Okay, they're costs in their own right. The overhead rate is calculated using the indirect manufacturing costs only. Given the data in that example, the overhead rate could be based on direct labour hours or direct machine hours. Okay, so let's look how we calculate this. The total indirect costs divided by the total allocation base, or the cost driver, is how we calculate the overhead rate. So our budgeted indirect costs are the ones that we had. Electricity, 100,000, repairs, 95,000, miscellaneous factory costs, 10,000, cleaning materials, 15,000, depreciation of factory machinery, 330,000, and indirect labour, 250,000. All of those added together come to our total budgeted indirect costs of 800,000. So to calculate rate 1, we're going to use the direct labour hours as the cost driver. So what we do is we take the 800,000 divided by the estimated direct labour hours, which is, in this example, 100,000 hours. So it comes to $8 per direct labour hour. The second rate we can calculate uses machine hours as the cost driver. So 800,000 divided by the estimated machine hours of 80,000 hours is $10 per machine hour. Okay, so that's how we calculate the two different rates. So what we can do now is cost a product. So assume the following additional information relate to a particular job, so job number 101. The direct labour hours for this job will be 15 direct labour hours, and the machine hours will be 20 machine hours for this job. So we're going to work out the manufacturing costs of job 101, assuming firstly that the firm uses direct labour hours as the cost driver, and second, the firm uses the machine hours as the cost driver. Okay, so let's go through and cost this job. For both A and B, the direct material and the direct labour costs will be identical. So $138 worth of direct material, and the direct labour cost will be 15 direct labour hours times $15, so $225. What is different when we're costing this is the overhead allocation, and this will differ depending on the cost driver used. So if we use direct labour hours as a cost driver, our overhead calculation will be, for this job, 15 direct labour hours times the overhead rate per direct labour hour. Okay, so the job's going to take 15 direct labour hours. So we'll take 15 times 8, the rate that we worked out in the previous part. So 15 times 8 means that we'll allocate $120 worth of overhead to this job. So we can now work out the manufacturing cost of job number 101. The direct materials, 138, the direct labour, 225, and the overhead allocation of 120 means the manufacturing cost for job 101 is $483. We can do this all again, but this time we use machine hours as the cost driver. So when we calculate the overhead calculation or the allocation of the overhead, 20 machine hours is what's going to be used in this job times the overhead rate per machine hour. So we had worked that out at $10 per machine hour. So we've got $20 times 10. So the overhead allocation for job 101 will be $200 using machine hours as the cost driver. So the manufacturing cost of job number 101, where we use machine hours as the cost driver, the direct materials and the direct labour will stay the same. They don't change. So $138 for direct materials, $225 for direct labour, and the $200 that we just calculated as the overhead allocation. So this time, the manufacturing cost of job 101 is $563. If we compare the methods in A and B, the important thing to note is that two different cost drivers give a different cost per unit. So $483 per unit or $563 per unit. Recall that the difference is due entirely to the overhead allocation. Direct materials and direct labours are the same under both. The difference is important where firms are using their cost to set prices. All right, so just another example. So we're going to look at example number 2. Quick and Easy Print Shop produces a variety of objects. So they produce brochures, wedding invitation cards, etc. For a particular year, the firm's budgeted overhead costs were $102,000. The firm's estimated direct labour hours for the year were 1,500 hours and expected printing or machine hours were 3,400 hours, and machines can run unattended at any time. So what we're required to calculate is calculate Quick and Easy's predetermined budgeted overhead rates, assuming the firm used firstly, or A, direct labour hours as the cost driver, and secondly, machine hours as the cost driver. Okay, so firstly, we're going to use direct labour hours as the cost driver. So remember the formula is total budgeted overhead over the total budgeted direct labour hours. So our total budgeted overhead in this example is $102,000 divided by the total budgeted direct labour hours, which is 1,500. So our overhead allocation rate using direct labour hours as the cost driver will be $68 per direct labour hour. This means that any job will be charged $68 overhead for every 1 hour of direct labour hour worked on the job. If we go to B, machine hours as the cost driver, total budgeted overhead divided by the total budgeted machine or printing hours. So $102,000 is our total budgeted overhead divided by 3,400, which is our total budgeted printing or machine hours. The total budget overhead rate using machine hours as our cost driver is $30 per machine hour. This means that a job will be charged $30 overhead for every machine hour worked on the job. Okay, so taking this a step further, the following data relates to an order for travel brochures for Flight Centre. The direct labour hours worked, 5 hours. The machine hours or printing hours are 7 hours. The direct material cost, 100. The direct labour cost, 250. What we're required to do is calculate the cost of the job. Firstly, if overhead is allocated on the basis of direct labour hours. Secondly, if overhead is allocated on the basis of machine hours. So the cost of the Flight Centre job order using overhead allocated using direct labour hours as the cost driver. The direct material cost is 100. The direct labour cost is 250. The overhead cost for the job is 5 direct labour hours times the overhead rate that we previously calculated for direct labour hours is $68. So the overhead allocation or the overhead cost here would be 340. So the cost of the job using direct labour hours as the cost driver would be $690. Now we're going to calculate it again using the overhead allocated using machine hours. Remember that the direct material cost and the direct labour cost will be the same. So the direct material cost will be 100. The direct labour cost will be 250. The overhead costs now, or the overhead allocation cost, will be 7 machine hours times the overhead rate of $30 using the machine hours as the cost driver. So 7 times 30 is 210. The cost of the job is $560. Note that there is a significant difference between the costs based on the overhead rate, and this is particularly critical if Quick and Easy is using the cost to set prices.